I ask unanimous consent that the senator from South Carolina be quiet.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to address the Senate as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I came to the floor today in support of the budget resolution for one reason. It's because it provides the Senate a path forward on tax reform. I strongly support this effort to fix America's burdensome tax system. It's my hope that reform will lead to simplifying the tax code, strengthening the middle class, and ultimately boosting our economy. Unfortunately, I cannot offer my support without reservation, so I've come to the floor today to explain my concerns and remind my colleagues of the important work ahead of us. Even as we support this resolution as a means to achieve meaningful tax reform, we must acknowledge the fact that the underlying budget contains an insufficient level of funding for national defense. As chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, my highest priority is to ensure our men and women serving in uniform have the training, equipment, and resources they need to keep our nation safe. The Senate budget resolution will set fiscal year 2018 defense spending at the levels dictated by the Budget Control Act cap. This budget is $54 billion less than the President's request and $86 billion less than this body authorized just last month in the National Defense Authorization Act. We passed the National Defense Authorization Act by a vote of 89-9, a demonstration of the overwhelming bipartisan belief that the Budget Control Act level defense spending is inadequate and unacceptable. Let me be clear. There is no BCA-level defense budget that would be sufficient to provide our military with what they need to fulfill current missions and prepare for future threats. For those of us who have been paying attention, we heard the warnings of the steady decline of our military. Time and again, our senior military and civilian defense leaders have sounded the alarm about the dangers of the Budget Control Act spending caps. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, our highest uniformed military officer, General Dunford, has warned that if we continue on the current path, he assesses that, and I quote, "Within 5 years, we will lose our ability to project power, the basis of how we defend the homeland, advance U.S. interests, and meet our alliance commitments." Make no mistake about what that means. America's military advantage is degrading. Without the ability to project power, the United States will no longer be a global power. That means we put at risk not only our ability to secure our interests and protect our nation, but also the unprecedented era of security and prosperity that American global leadership has provided the world. And I might add, for the benefit of my colleagues, former President George W. Bush today gave a very, very strong statement emphasizing this problem and challenge that we face. This is the strategic reality we are facing in the next 5 years. It should not be a surprise. We've seen the steady degradation of the military. The strain of constant operational tempo, combined with inadequate and unstable funding, has over the past 16 years worn down the greatest military in the road. Just this last week, our Secretary of Defense, Mattis, sent a letter to the Armed Services Committee expressing his concerns with regard to the National Defense Authorization Act we are currently negotiating with the House. The very first thing he said, before addressing any of the policy changes and reforms in the bill, is that his primary concern is the Budget Control Act. And we know why. Because the defense spending caps are doing such immense harm to our military. Secretary Mattis wrote, quote, "As I have testified before your committee, no enemy has done more to harm the warfighting readiness of our military than sequestration." I'll repeat that for the benefit of my colleagues. No enemy has done more to harm the warfighting readiness of our military than sequestration. Current caps continue to unnecessarily defer critical maintenance, limit aviation availability, delay modernization, and strain our men and women in uniform. We've seen the evidence of this harm. Over the last few months, there have been a rash of training accidents, collisions, and crashes. We are seeing the tragic accidents in the news far too often. 7 sailors were killed when the USS Fitzgerald collided with a container ship off the coast of Japan. A Marine KC-130 crash in Mississippi killed all 16 troops on board. An Osprey helicopter crashed off the coast of Australia, resulted in the deaths of 3 Marines. An Army helicopter crashed off the coast of Hawaii, with 5 soldiers presumed dead. 10 sailors perished when the USS McCain collided with a tanker near Singapore. An Army Black Hawk helicopter went down during a training mission off the coast of Yemen, and 1 soldier died. 1 soldier died during helicopter training at Fort Hood. An amphibious vehicle explosion at Camp Pendleton injured 15 Marines. A demolition accident at Fort Bragg killed 1 soldier and injured 7 others. 2 Navy pilots died in a T-45 crash in Tennessee. My friends, we are now losing more of our men and women in uniform in totally avoidable training accidents than we are in combat. There's plenty of blame to go around for all of these incidents, but we cannot ignore the fact that Congress's inability to provide adequate, stable, and predictable budgeting has contributed to the troubling state of affairs. And while increased funding is not the only answer, there is no scenario where our military can get healthy and ready to meet the challenges of an increasingly unstable world without additional resources. There's broad bipartisan agreement about that from members of the House of Representatives, here in the Senate, and the President. And yet, we're about to vote for a budget resolution that severely underfunds the military. Because the reality is, as we all know, that it will not impact the actual appropriations. To solve these problems and to fulfill our duty to the men and women in uniform, we must negotiate a bipartisan budget agreement that will lift the caps on defense spending. Only then can we rebuild the military, reverse the disturbing readiness crisis, and retain our ability to project power and secure our interests around the world. Might I remind my colleagues that the fiscal year starting 3 weeks ago, and that the Defense Department is currently operating under a continuing resolution. We know the harmful effects it will have on the military. That's why getting to work on a budget deal is so urgent. We must delay no longer. The budget resolution is not meant to provide that broader budget agreement. This budget resolution is simply a means to get us to tax reform. However, this budget resolution does represent something extremely troubling. The Republican Party used to be unified in its support for a strong national defense. If our leaders in Congress and the White House don't immediately get to work negotiating a deal to lift the defense caps and fund the military at a higher level than in this budget resolution, I'm not sure we'll be able to claim that mantle any longer. Mr. President, I just want to sum up by saying we have a problem in the military today, and that is whenever there's cuts in defense spending, the first thing that goes is the easy ones, the training, the readiness, the spare parts, the flying hours. Those are the ones that get cut first because they're the easiest. Cutting a major weapon system or program is extremely difficult. So now we have this list, as I just read off, of men and women serving in the military that we are responsible, at least partially, for their death and injury. Why? Because they're not able to be trained, they're not able to be equipped, they're not able to be maintained. 60% of the F-18s are not able to fly. We have sailors and airmen who are working 100-hour work weeks. We have gigantic problems with the ability to simply operate. Meanwhile, our adversaries are stepping up their capabilities. Obviously, every time we turn around, there's another crisis of some kind. Look at the world 8 years ago and look at the world today, you will find an incredible deterioration of America's position and influence in the world. The front page of the Economist magazine this week has a picture of the dictator of China, and the title is "The Most Powerful Man in the World." And it's true, and it's true. And so here we are with a budget resolution that basically has cut our military, that is basically not funding what we need. And my friends, I do not mean to get emotional, but why should we send these young men and women in uniform in harm's way without all they need in order to fight and defend this nation? Right now, they're not ready. Right now, their planes can't fly. Right now, they're not able to operate and train. They are not ready. And that is not John McCain's word. That is our military leaders' words. And some of the most respected people in America and in the world, General Mattis, General McMaster, General Kelly, they will all tell you the same thing. And we're sending our young men and women into hazardous situations without them being completely equipped and capable of defending themselves. That's wrong. What greater responsibility do we have than to the men and women who are serving us in uniform today? 4 just died in Niger. How many members of this body, how many of the 100 members of this body knew we even had an operation in Niger? Well, I won't go into the details in deference to the family, but this is wrong what we're doing. We saw it in the 70s, and now we're seeing it again. It was Mark Twain, I believe, that said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And it's beginning to rhyme. And if we don't, with this evolution that we're going through, increase our spending to the level as authorized by the Defense Authorization Act, then we will bear some responsibility for what happens. Mr. President, I yield the floor.